that and planning on attending that. All right, so like I said, you should have one of these outlines, and this is going to be our outline for the next couple of weeks, just depending on how long it takes us to get through the book of Hosea. And as I had mentioned over the last couple of weeks, our goal this year on Wednesday nights is to go through the minor prophets, the last 12 books of the Old Testament, and starting here with Hosea. And ultimately we talked about a prophet and what the purpose of a prophet was. We talked about the role of the prophet, how it came about, the reputation of the prophet, and how he was a holy individual, and then the responsibility of the prophet, which was to speak the words of the Lord boldly and unashamedly. And then last week we went ahead and took that a step further and mentioned that there are a few things that we have to understand in order to comprehend these minor prophets or comprehend these last 12 books. First off, that the election of Israel was a historic event, and it is something that God has honored. He chose the nation of Israel out of all the nations of the world at that time, and even today, the nation of Israel was selected by God because of the faith of their patriarch Abraham. And they have continued to see that faith in the Old Testament through Isaac and Jacob and Moses and so many others. Then the second thing that we said has to be reminded or understood, in order to comprehend these books is the historical events that took place, the urbanization of the nation of Israel, how they went from being farmers to being merchant men and women. And then secondly, how that they had the rise of the ascension of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. And then third, the resurrection of the city of Jerusalem from the ashes that it had been laid waste to. And so we looked at these things and said it's important for us to understand these if we're going to understand these books. And then, of course, the third thing was that all of these books have the same basic ingredients. And I gave you 5 things that all 12 of these minor prophets, their books consist of. Now, as we look to the book of Hosea, I told you that this book ultimately teaches us that sin not only breaks the law of God, but it breaks the heart of God. And tonight I want us to go ahead and see how far we can get in Roman numeral number 1, which covers chapter 1 to chapter 3. And we're going to read through it, and we're going to go ahead and talk about it as we go along. So let's go ahead and look here, if we would, at the first 2 verses. Hosea 1 and verse 1 says, "The word of the Lord that came unto Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. The beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, Go take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord." So we're going to see first off the signs that are mentioned here in this first chapter. And underneath the signs, we see the challenge to the prophet in these first 2 verses. Now, in verse number 1, we are told who Hosea is. He's the son of Beeri. We're given a time frame when he prophesied, or when his prophecy was given to him from God to give to the people. And we're told that he prophesied during the reign of 4 of the kings of Judah and just 1 of the kings of Israel. Now, ultimately, this book is directed, in the majority of it, is directed at the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom. It's directed at this last king who's mentioned, Jeroboam. And he's known by the name of Jeroboam the second. Jeroboam the first was the one that, if you remember back to the books of the Kings and the Chronicles, Solomon had died, and after he had died, his son Rehoboam had come to power. And Rehoboam had said to the people, if you think my dad was harsh, if you think his rule was tough, wait till I get done. And so remember, the majority of the tribes left Rehoboam and followed a man by the name of Jeroboam. And Jeroboam caused the people of God to sin. He led them away from the one true God and led them to idols. And then over the time from Jeroboam up until this man, Jeroboam the second, you had kings such as Ahab who ruled. And then one of the one of the ancestors of this Jeroboam was a man by the name of Jehu. Jehu. And so Jeroboam mentioned here, this Jeroboam the second, he is the last of the kings of Israel that is going to reign until God brings about judgment upon this nation using the Assyrian Empire to bring about his judgment. So we see who Hosea is a little bit. We see when he prophesied. Now let's go ahead and look a little bit more into the challenge of the prophet in verse number 2. It says, the beginning of the word of the Lord by Hosea. And the Lord said to Hosea, go take unto thee a wife of whoredoms and children of whoredoms, for the land hath committed great whoredom, departing from the Lord. Now I want you to stop for a moment, and I want you to think about this. Who Hosea is. He is a prophet. And what did we say the reputation of a prophet was? It was to be holy, to be separated, to live their life according to the scripture that had been given to them, according to the law of God. So here was a holy man, Hosea, and God had spoken to him. Now, we can't truly comprehend what it was like for Hosea to have God speak to him. Yes, we understand God speaking to us through his word, and no doubt Hosea understood what it meant to have God speak through the law and through the Old Testament scriptures to him. But now God is going to speak to him in a very different way. He's going to speak to him in a way that he did not speak to very many people. And so the Bible tells us that the word of the Lord that came to him was this in verse 2. Go, take unto thee a wife of whoredoms. God gives a challenge to the prophet to go find a wife. Now, this ultimately tells us that Hosea was not a married man before this. We don't know his age. He may have been a young man, but we don't know his exact age. And God is telling him, I want you to go find a wife. Now, young men obviously are always excited about the prospect of meeting that future spouse, that one that they're going to spend the rest of their life with. But imagine being in Hosea's position here, as God tells him, I want you to go find a wife, and this wife is going to be a woman of whoredoms. And notice that that word whoredoms is not singular, but it is plural, meaning that she had lived the life of a harlot. She had lived the life of a prostitute. Now, Brother Smith pointed out Rahab the harlot on Sunday night in his message, and we throw out that term of a harlot very easily, and we don't really sometimes think about the life that an individual who was called a harlot or came from whoredoms was actually involved in. He's saying to Hosea, you who are a holy man, go and marry an unholy woman. Now, once again, think about being Hosea, if you would. I mean, in Hosea's mind, he may have been asking himself, wait a second, is this really God that's telling me to do this? Is this really the voice of the Lord speaking to me? Lord, why would you want me to go marry a harlot? And the answer, the reassurance that this is God and this is not the devil and this is not one of his minions or one of the demons speaking and telling him to do this, is found in the very next phrase there in verse number 2. For the land hath committed great whoredom. And what was that great whoredom? Departing from the Lord. He says, I want you to go and find a wife who is a harlot, a wife of whoredoms, and I want you to marry her. I want you to love her, because your marriage to her and your love for her and your relationship with her is going to be a picture to the northern kingdom, who I am going to have you prophesy to, of their relationship or my relationship with them. And he's going to explain it all here in a minute. What a great step of faith that had to be for Hosea to go out and to do this. And notice that it doesn't just say that he was going to take unto himself a wife of whoredoms. But if you look back to verse number 2, it says, and children of whoredoms. What does that mean? We'll see here as we continue reading through this chapter. Let's look at the second thing here underneath the second thing underneath the signs, the children of the prophet. The children of the prophet are mentioned now from verses 3 to 11. And let's read starting in verse 3. It says, so he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, which conceived and bare him a son. Now the name Gomer means completion. And her father, his name Diblaim, it is a name that ultimately refers to two clusters of figs, and figs were something that the Jews, of course, were known to eat. Remember, Jesus had gone when he was traveling with his disciples to Jerusalem. He had passed by a fig tree and was looking for some figs to be on that tree, and there were no figs, and so he had pronounced judgment upon that tree. The Jews were known to enjoy figs and to eat them commonly. And so the name of Diblaim, talking about two clusters of figs, and the name of Gomer being one of completion, when we think about who these two people were, and though we aren't told a lot about them, and we know that Gomer was a harlot, it reminds us of the desire that the world has, the desires that the world tries to fulfill, and ultimately how that she was a daughter of desires. She was a woman who had been given over to a worldly lifestyle, to an unholy lifestyle. Now, read on there with me, if you would, in verse number 3. It says, which conceived and bare him a son. Now, I want you to notice that phrase there. If you want, you can write it in your notes or you can underline it in your Bible. But notice it says, which conceived and bare him a son. And I'll explain why here in a minute. So she bears a son to Hosea. Verse number 4 tells us that the Lord comes to him and tells Hosea what to name this son. And the Lord said unto him, call his name Jezreel. For yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause to cease the kingdom of the house of Israel. And it shall come to pass at that day that I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. Now let me stop here for a minute and just sort of go back real briefly and tell you some Old Testament history that you may be familiar with, all right? There once was a king by the name of Ahab, as we know, whose wife's name was Jezebel. And these people were obviously wicked. We know about the prophet Elisha, who had gone up to Mount Carmel to call down fire from heaven during the reign of Ahab and his wife Jezebel. Well, the Bible tells us that God used a man by the name of Jehu, who's mentioned here, to bring about judgment upon Ahab and Ahab's house. And ultimately, it was a result of Ahab and Jezebel, and how that Jezebel had conspired against a man by the name of Naboth, who had a field. And Naboth was a Jezreelite. And so they had ultimately had him killed. Jezebel had this man Naboth killed, and had his vineyard given to the king, or taken by the king. And so God sent Jehu to bring judgment upon Ahab and his house. Now God told Jehu that he and his family would reign over Israel in the stead of Ahab for 4 generations. This man Jeroboam, who's mentioned in verse number 1, Jeroboam II, was the offspring of Jehu. He was a descendant of that man Jehu, who brought this judgment upon Ahab and Jezebel. Now, God tells him, I want you to call the name of your firstborn son Jezreel. The name Jezreel means, may God scatter, or may God sow. Much like you would throw out seed, or you would scatter seed, he wanted the name of this young man to be Jezreel, because He was going to bring upon the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom. He was going to bring judgment upon them, and he was going to scatter them. When the Assyrian army later came in and conquered the capital city of the northern kingdom, which was Samaria, there were people that were taken back to Assyria and back to the capital there. But there were many others that were scattered among the Gentile nations. And so that first son, that first child, his name is Jezreel. Let's look to the second one. And you'll notice in your outlines that talks about Jezreel, a nation defeated. Second thing is a nation deported, Lo-Ruhamah. In verse 6, and she conceived again and bare a daughter, and God said unto him, call her name Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no more have mercy upon the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. But I will have mercy upon the house of Judah, and will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, nor by sword, nor by battle, by horses, nor by horsemen. So the Bible tells us that Gomer has a second child. This second child is a daughter, and God tells Hosea to name her Lo-Ruhamah. Now that name Lo-Ruhamah means not beloved. Not beloved. She ultimately was a product of whoredoms. She was a child of whoredoms. Notice once again, back in verse number 2, that it says that he was not only going to take a wife of whoredoms, but he was going to take children of whoredoms. And I mentioned to you at the end of verse number 3 that it says that Gomer conceived and bare him a son. And that son was named Jezreel. But in verse number 6 it says, and she conceived again and bare a daughter. It does not say and bare him a daughter. She bare a daughter. Ultimately what happened here is that Gomer was taken out of whoredoms, was taken out of a lifestyle of a harlot, married by Hosea. Hosea loved her and tried to show her the love that God says that a husband is supposed to have for his wife, and the Lord blessed their marriage, and they had this first child, this boy named Jezreel. But then Gomer goes back out into adultery. She goes back out into these whoredoms. And the reason why the Bible does not say that she bare him a daughter is because he does not know if this is his child or not. Yet, he does take this child as his own, as we'll see here a little bit more in chapter number 2. So there's a question mark. Is this his daughter? Is this not his daughter? God says, you're going to name this child Lo-Ruhamah. You're going to name her not beloved. You're going to make it known that the nation of Israel is going to feel the wrath of God, and they are going to feel as though they're not beloved or not loved, because they're going to face the judgment that comes. You know, when we tell our kids we have to discipline our children when they do wrong, and if you've ever had to discipline your child by a spanking, then you've probably said the same thing that your parents said to you. This is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. And your kids probably thought the same thing that you thought when your parents said that. You're a liar. It's going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. Ultimately, when a child gets disciplined like that, they may not feel as though they are loved at that point in time. They don't understand the way that we do as a father or a mother, that the reason that we're disciplining them is because we love them, not because we hate them. And so they feel as though they are not beloved. He says, my judgment is going to come upon the nation of Israel, and they are going to feel as though they are not beloved. But the nation of Judah, I'm going to show them mercy. See, the nation of Judah had godly kings. 4 of these kings are mentioned in this book in verse number 1, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. God was going to save the nation of Judah, the southern kingdom, and save their capital city, Jerusalem, from the Assyrian army. It was not going to be the military of Hezekiah that would ultimately save them. It was going to be the army of God, the direct intervention of God that was going to save them. Thirdly, the third child we see here in verse number 8 says, Now when she had weaned Lo-ruhamah, she conceived and bare a son. Then said God, Call his name Lo-ammi, for ye are not my people, and I will not be your God. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, Ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, Ye are the sons of the living God. Then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. So now Gomer, after weaning Lo-ruhamah, she gets pregnant again. And the Bible once again here does not say that she bare to him, to Hosea, a child, but that she bare a child, bare a son. And God says, all right, Hosea, here's this third child, and I want you to name this child Lo-ammi. That name Lo-ammi means not my people, or no kin of mine. No kin of mine. Now, interestingly enough, that definition, no kin of mine, is important because we're going to see later on that Hosea doesn't actually refer to this son Lo-ammi by that name. And I'll explain that here in chapter number 2. So he says, name him Lo-ammi, no kin of mine. And then he tells how that even though his judgment is going to come upon the nation of Israel, and that they are not his people anymore, not because he doesn't love them, but because they have not chosen him. It reminds us of what Paul talked about, how that we should come out and be separate. And if we'll be separate from the world and will not touch the unclean thing, that ultimately God will be a father to us and we will be his children. We understand as born-again believers, we are the children of God. But when we live ungodly and when we live in sin, we break fellowship with God. He's still our Father, the way that the prodigal son still had his father, the prodigal, at home. But he did not have that relationship. And so that's what Lo-ammi, that's what he was supposed to depict to the people, is that your sin has not only brought judgment upon you, or will bring judgment upon you as a nation, but it has severed that relationship that you once had with your Heavenly Father. And you no more are his children, or you no more enjoy the relationship of being his children. Now notice here at the end of this chapter, in verse number 11, that we have a promise of the future. I mentioned in the 5 ingredients that all of these minor prophets have in their writings, that they all have a promise of the future. And here in verse number 11, Hosea is told by God that one day Judah and Israel are going to be gathered together and they're going to appoint for themselves one head. And notice it says at the end of verse number 11, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. That's referring to the battle of Armageddon in the book of Revelation. In the valley of Jezreel, or Jezreel as some like to say, one day the nation of Judah, the nation of Israel, the Jewish people, one day they will realize that there is just one God. Once again, Jehovah God. And that His Son, Jesus Christ, is their Savior. In that battle of Armageddon, in that valley of Jezreel. It's in that place where Jesus Christ is going to be revealed and is going to be made known to all the world, including these two groups of people, these two nations. Moving on real quickly here to chapter number 2, and we won't get through all of chapter number 2, but I do want to point out something here in verses 1 through 4, and we'll leave it off, or we'll leave off there with verses 1 through 4 and come back to verse number 5 next Wednesday. But chapter number 2 talks about the sins. The sins. And there's a personal note here in verses 1 through 4. Look there if you would with me, and it says in verse number 1, say ye unto your brethren, Ammi, and to your sisters, Ruhamah, plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, neither am I her husband. Let her therefore put away her whoredoms out of her sight, and her adultery from between her breasts, lest I strip her naked and set her as in the day that she was born, and make her as a wilderness, and set her like a dry land, and slay her with thirst. And I will not have mercy upon her children, for they be the children of whoredoms. Now right here, and we're going to close with this, there's a personal note here. Hosea has been given a responsibility by God to name 3 children. To name Jezreel, to name Lo-Ruhamah, and to name Lo-Ami. But notice here in verse number 1 that he only addresses 2, Ami and Ruhamah. Now, Ruhamah is really the name that, I guess you could say, the pet name, or the name that he used, the fatherly name that he used for the second child, for the daughter Lo-Ruhamah. He just called her Ruhamah, which meant pitied one. And then he called Lo-Ami just by the name Ami. Now that name Lo-Ami, remember, means no kin of mine. So Ami simply means mine. These were not children of his, yet he considered Ami his. He considered Ruhamah the girl that he pitied, that he had pity upon, as she was born to a mother of whoredoms, a mother who could not tell her, hey, this is your father, because she had not been faithful to Hosea. Nonetheless, he took those children, even though they were not his own. He took those children under his wing. He loved them. He cared for them. He treated them as though they were his own. And these children at this point are old enough to understand that Hosea's yearning for their mother, and they're able to understand their mother's shame and the lifestyle that she's lived. And so in verse number 2, he gives them a challenge. He says, plead with your mother. Plead. For she is not my wife, neither am I her husband. He uses the word plead twice. He says, plead with your mother. She has not been a wife to me, and I have not been able to be a husband to her, because she has not been faithful and she has not stayed in this home. No doubt Hosea was really a single father, raising these 3 children. He says, if at all you can influence your mother, influence her. If she'll listen to you, plead with her. I want us to stop right there with that personal note tonight, because ultimately, remember that this is an illustration. That Gomer is supposed to be a picture of the northern kingdom, the nation of Israel. And her children are to be a picture of the inhabitants of that nation. So ultimately, this personal note here in verses 1 through 4 is like saying to the inhabitants of the northern kingdom, Israel, hey, plead with your nation to turn back to God. Plead with your nation to turn back to the one who has been faithful to your nation, even though your nation has not been faithful to him. And I believe that that is something that, once again, is applicable to us tonight. Though the United States of America, as we said, was never selected and never elected and never made a covenant with God the way that the nation of Israel did. We look at our history and we believe that our country was founded upon the Word of God and upon biblical principles by godly and God-fearing men. And in the 21st century, we need to plead with our nation to turn back to the God who made this nation great. Amen. We need to plead with our nation to turn back to the God who has been faithful to this nation through all of its troubles and trials, through the world wars and through the various conflicts, even on our own soil. God has been faithful to this nation, but this nation has not been faithful to God. And we need to make a plea to our nation once again. Tonight, we have a very big responsibility upon ourselves. Because just like Hosea, we are in the minority. Being a prophet in a time, by the way, under the reign of Jeroboam, the nation of Israel was prosperous. They were not suffering. And so for him to come out and to proclaim that judgment was coming, no doubt people probably thought, what are you talking about? I mean, we've never had it so good since maybe the days of Solomon. But the judgment of God was coming. I want to caution you, I'm not against our current president or our future president. I pray for both of them. I'm not against any of our elected officials. I'm praying for them. But we cannot look to our elected officials as the future of our country. They are just symbols of what our country already is. And so if we really want to change our country, it starts right here. A lot of these politicians, whether they were running for Senate or they were running for the presidency, you probably heard this term used a lot during the political race, a grassroots movement. What did that mean? It meant people in small towns, small communities, getting the word out. You know why some people were successful and others weren't? Because of grassroots movements. And if we are going to be successful in turning our nation back to God, who has been faithful to our nation, it starts with a grassroots movement. You know what that is? It's called Saturday Soul Winning. Hello. It's called inviting people to church, at work, in your neighborhood, out in the community as you're shopping. That's what it's going to take. We cannot be the silent majority because we are not the majority anymore. And I dare say we should definitely not be the silent minority, or we're going to watch our country digress even faster. And so let me challenge you tonight to take that personal note that Hosea gave to these children, Ami and Ruhama. Hey, plead. Plead with your mother. Plead with her. And may we plead with the people of our community and the people of our nation. May we also plead to God that He'll keep His hand stretched out to our nation, to our world, and continue to show mercy. Father, thank you for all that you've done for us and given to us, Lord. I pray that you'd help us tonight as we study this book. We study this prophet,